Hi, this is Benjamin Albritton, Rare Books Curator at Stanford Libraries. And my presentation for Dark Archives 2020 is Found Within, Discovery in Complex Objects. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of Dark Archives for inviting me and for putting together an absolutely fantastic presentation. I can't wait to see all of the talks from my fellow panelists. And while my discussion is called Found Within, it's perhaps more appropriate to say Hidden Within, because what I'm going to be talking about are the various ways that our approaches to discovery fail us when it comes to large-scale digital projects or even smaller scale descriptions. So over the course of this next 15 or 20 minutes, I'll be talking about discovery within a single item. I'll be talking about discovery across a collection, and I'll also be talking about approaches to discovery across multiple collections. I'd like to begin this discussion by asking a simple question. Can a catalog ever be enough? And by that I mean our traditional ways of thinking about cataloging fall short when we start dealing with scale and with digital access to large numbers of users across large numbers of objects. One way to begin when we're asking questions about how we might approach traditional cataloging in digital materials is to kind of flip the question around from how are people using a catalog to find materials and thinking more generally, how are people finding medieval materials on the web? To that end, I'd like to look at some of the Google Analytics from Parker on the Web and talk about how people are finding that particular site. Now, there could be different results depending on which site we're talking about. If it's eCodices or the Vatican, they may have different results, but Parker on the Web, I think, is fairly exemplary. And what we see as we're looking at this graph is that the homepage of Parker on the Web, most people are coming to it from a Google search. And that's a pretty clear front runner for referral routes. Corpus Christi College itself has a number of sites that point to Parker on the Web, and they are the second highest in terms of ways into the Parker on the Web website. The next highest after that is something that Google Analytics calls direct. And you might think that means getting there directly from a URL typed into the browser window. But it can come from a number of different ways, directly typed in people's bookmarks or referrers that simply don't have what the required information to pick up where that referral came from. Things get even a little bit more interesting as we look directly at where some of the manuscripts are being found. So we built Parker on the Web with the expectation that people would go to the portal and then search for the manuscript that they're after. But what we're seeing, as this slide shows, is that people are following a direct path into a specific manuscript. And as you can see in the right-hand column of this particular slide, most of the time they're finding that manuscript directly through Google or another search engine. This was a little bit unexpected for us. But when we start looking at Google results, as you're typing in, say, Parker Library Manuscript 286, just into Google, the direct link into Parker on the Web to that specific manuscript within Parker on the Web is the top hit. The second highest hit after that is to an aggregator, to the Biblissima IIIF Discovery site where Parker has been indexed in. And that's the second hit. So we're seeing people come directly into Parker on the Web through Google, or they're being sent out to an aggregator and bypassing the Parker on the Web portal altogether. So there's something to be learned there about how discovery works now. And it will certainly help us reflect on how attention to metadata within Parker on the Web matters for the audiences that we're trying to reach now. As I mentioned in my last slide, the Biblissima portal which aggregates about 74,000 manuscripts at this point, all available through the International Image Interoperability Framework, has become a site that people do discovery in. And we've run into now something that we might start thinking of as an interoperability problem. When we built Parker on the Web back in 2006 to 2009, the existing paradigm was that you would find a manuscript by going to a library or portal or project site and searching within that. The rise of IIIF over the last decade means that now we have several 100,000 medieval manuscripts available across a number of different institutions with vastly different cataloging standards and approaches. And the Biblissima portal has invested some time and energy and a lot of work into harmonizing metadata from a number of contributing platforms. So you can search across 73,484 manuscripts in their portal and do discovery that way. But then there are other sites like the Vatican, and here I've got a slide showing the Digital Vatican Library manuscript collection, and they're getting pretty close to 20,000 manuscripts. So we've now got an aggregator and an individual library, and they're not necessarily talking to each other right now. So when we start thinking from a user's perspective about what we need in terms of actual discovery, things start to take shape in a different way. So I can't search across Biblissima and the Vatican. I can't search across Parker and the Vatican. And then also, there's a question of updating metadata as we go through these projects. So Biblissima has invested in converting the Parker data at a certain snapshot in time. But the Parker metadata is being continually edited and updated as we go through, not least because we made a mistake with some of the initial crosswalks that we did when we moved from Parker 1.0 to Parker 2.0, and a little bit of data got left off that we are incorporating back into the site now. So at some point, there'll be a disconnect between Parker on the Web and the aggregator who's using it, Biblissima in this case. So one of the areas I'd like to explore in terms of a challenge to the traditional catalog is incorporating scholarship or crowdsourced data from digital projects. Here we start to bump up against the real limits of what a catalog can be when we consider bringing together multiple transcriptions from different manuscript witnesses. As an example, I would like to use the La Sfera challenge that Dr. Morreale led this summer and I assisted with, where we brought together a number of different witnesses of Gorodati's La Sfera for community transcription. We had team-based transcription for each witness, and the transcriptions wound up producing the teams wound up producing 8 fully transcribed witnesses of this text. And we can immediately start to see the issues that this will raise if we just incorporated these transcriptions back into their repositories for discovery as annotations. And the main problems that you run into immediately are differences in orthography, differences in approaches between the different teams who are transcribing, layout, arrangement, and then of course the normal variants that you might expect to see in terms of vocabulary. All of these things coming together, being brought back into an aggregated discovery site, are going to be extraordinarily problematic from a user discovery point of view. And they also then, of course, challenge the types of discovery that we think of when we think of browsing shelf marks or looking for a specific text title. Here we're looking at something far deeper and far richer, right down to the word level. And that's going to present us a number of problems as we start to think about building user interfaces. So I'm going to turn now to a project that Dr. Elaine Traharn and I worked on along with some of our colleagues to expose about 100,000 images from the Parker on the Web project to a computer vision lab that was using machine learning to do feature extraction. There were a number of features, and Professor Traharn has talked about this in talks of her own. But I wanted to call out one in particular, which was a desire to have a computer recognize a decorated initial across all of those images from Parker on the Web. So as I said before, about 100,000 images, and the goal was to recognize decorated initials across them. And why decorated initials? Well, for this audience, it's probably obvious. For some of our library colleagues, it was a little less obvious, but decorated initials mark a signpost within the medieval text. They are usually at a significant break or beginning part of a text, and they can help you as a reader navigate through a bound manuscript fairly quickly, and also through a digitized manuscript. As you're scrolling through images, you will be able to recognize the beginning of a text fairly easily. So Professor Traharn's idea was, if you could recognize these and extract them, what could that tell us about navigation within a manuscript? And what we found that it told us is that a machine can do this. What we're seeing here is a result set, a very simplified result set from the project. And it starts to raise questions about navigating within a project like Parker on the Web. Instead of navigating through catalog data, could you navigate through decorated styles? Could you navigate through decorated initials or significant initials to find places in the text that you wanted to start as a user? Does it mean that we need to be rethinking the user interface for the types of things that people might be using to navigate a site, rather than simply looking for a manuscript shelf mark, or even an incipit or name of a text or author? So as we scroll through this, we can see that the algorithm was quite successful. There are a few hits or misses here where it got a little bit fooled by the shape of the text or the decoration within a manuscript. But for the most part, it was able to find decorated initials fairly easily, which gives us, from the 100,000 manuscripts, approximately 10 to 15,000 significant points within a text, significant signposts within the text that we could navigate through. And the real question, I think, for me, working on the digital project, is what do we do with this? Do we put these back into Parker on the Web as annotations produced by the project? And if so, what does that mean? What information needs to go along with those? We've found all of these initials within Parker, but how do we tell people about that? What use is it for a casual user of Parker on the Web? And what it suggests to me is, not only do we need to think about the way we describe these things so that they're discoverable within basic catalog search of Parker on the Web, but we also need to think about quickly building new interfaces to navigate this material. So it's pretty easy to move from that particular image out to a full image of the page, as we've seen here, or even to the manuscript itself that the initial comes from. So navigating from the micro up to the macro size of the book, or then across the Parker on the Web collection as a whole. Now this becomes an even more interesting proposition when we think about running all of the manuscripts from Biblissima or all of the manuscripts from the Vatican through this particular algorithm and extracting as many significant initials as we can. Not only could we compare stylistically across a number of repositories, but we could also navigate in basically a non-portal sort of way, not even a manuscript way, through large amounts of data, large amounts of manuscript textual material in ways that we haven't before. By simply relying on a catalog, we have essentially undercut some of what can be done digitally fairly quickly now with machines. So over the last two sections of this talk, I've discussed the complications of rich discovery in a uniform way across platforms. And of course, the dream would be that the minutest detail in any project could be discoverable across a large-scale aggregator, whether that's catalog material produced by a human being, whether it's observations from scholars that are published or unpublished, or machine learning algorithms extracting features and thereby providing entire new data sets with which to navigate the large corpus of digitized medieval material that we have now. What I haven't talked about, and what I'd like to end my use cases with, is the human element, and particularly provenance and all of the stories that get lost when you move from the rich human experience of manuscript acquisition, collecting, transmission to a catalog record, and what is missing there. I'm going to take as a use case the Stanford Virgil, our manuscript codex M0380 casebook CV. It's a 15th century Italian manuscript, which we've had in our collections since just about 1940. If we look at the catalog record for this, our bibliographic information is a little sparse. But if we look at the provenance itself, it says it's a gift of the estate of Henry Rushton Fairclough, 1940. So we know that we acquired this in 1940 from Rushton Fairclough, who was one of the initial sort of founders of the classics department here at Stanford. He joined the Stanford faculty in 1893, very early in the university's life. Over the next 35 years, he helped to build an interest in classics at Stanford and helped to build the classics department that existed through the 20th century and into the 21st century. He edited the Loeb Virgil, still in use today, including the bucolics, the Georgics, and the Aeneid, all of which appear in the Stanford manuscript. And he passed away in 1938 with many papers and books coming to our library from his estate, including this Virgil Codex. So at face value, the catalog record shows we received the material from Fairclough in about 1940 from his estate, and it makes absolute sense that he would have it. A prominent professor in the early Stanford days with a focus on Virgil. So seeing a copy of the Aeneid, the bucolics, and the Georgics in a manuscript form in his possession was not surprising. But there's a lot more to the story. So we know from De Ricci that Fairclough had this book when the census was done. And so we can push the provenance back into the period when De Ricci was doing his work. But we can push it even further back than that. And the picture that you see here is from an 1899 production that Fairclough, seen here, organized. This was one of the things that he did to raise awareness and interest in the classics, were fairly regular stage performances of classical theater. In the archives, though, I was able to find correspondence between Fairclough and a former student of his, Joseph Jarnick. And you see Jarnick here on the right in the same play. In September 1903, Joseph Jarnick wrote to Professor Fairclough, the reason why I wanted to write you is this. Some time ago, I was able to purchase from Germany a Virgil manuscript of the 15th century. It's a parchment manuscript, mutilated somewhat to be sure, but not to a very great extent. I've been thinking that perhaps you may have some occasion to use it in your seminary classes, since, according to the schedule, Virgil is to be the author read in the seminary, et cetera, et cetera. So that's September 1903. December 1903, apparently Fairclough wrote back and said, where'd you get this manuscript? And what do you know about it? And Jarnick responds that he knows nothing more than what he saw in the German catalog, where it described the manuscript briefly. And so I haven't been able to track back which catalog that is, but I'm hopeful that at some point we'll be able to put a catalog entry from 1902, 1903 to this manuscript. So that raises the interesting question of what a knowledge graph around every manuscript looks like, and what are the requirements for producing a different sort of user experience for navigating through the vast, unremarked data about manuscript movements, about manuscript provenance, and about the types of details that we find within those manuscripts. If we take Jarnik as an example, we've lost the information about where he found the manuscript. We may be able to recover it, and we may be able to build the story of this manuscript back even further. But we can't put this whole story into a short catalog record. And so thinking about this as a way of attaching information to objects in the digital world becomes more and more appealing. So allowing a user to find the manuscript and then to explore all of the little bits of information that are associated with that manuscript in some way becomes a requirement. And when we start thinking about how we might accomplish that, small details start to arise, and then larger questions definitely come into play. The first question that arises, of course, is how do we refer to these things? And fortunately, the world of linked data provides us plenty of models for attaching information to entities and identifiers, and then linking that information together. What has been a little less apparent as we start building up knowledge graphs is what a general user would do with that information. How do you find Joseph Jarnik and find your way to the Stanford manuscript and find the data points along the way that are of interest for any given user?
To conclude then, I'd just like to recap what we've talked about, which is the need to move beyond the standard catalog precisely because it's inadequate for finding within once we get to the scale of large-scale digital projects like we're seeing now. Instead, it would be interesting to think about an ecosystem of information that ties together citable URLs for manuscripts in a number of different repositories, linked data identifiers like the International Standard Manuscript Identifier that has been suggested in a number of European projects, and the publishing systems that we know now. Some way to embed those identifiers into current publishing platforms. But what we're seeing as well is something that's missing, and that is an element in our scholarly communication environment that would support micro-publications of observations of scholarly thoughts and additions to manuscript materials that could be citable, that could be persistent, almost like a feed of notes and queries in a linked data environment that could then tie together new scholarship, manuscript repositories in a linked data sort of way and bring clouds of information to our discovery experience. So no longer would we necessarily be simply browsing through manuscripts, but we could follow paths of information that have been developed by scholars in a number of different areas. So we've got the data, but can we build a user interface that makes sense in this new world? Can we find within this giant mass of digital data the things that we're looking for? And underlying that query, of course, is whether we can model our domain information in such a way that would support building new interfaces upon it. How do we maintain growth over time as new information comes into the system all the time? Will we have to be constantly reevaluating a model or can we build upon a foundation and grow with it so that it doesn't become out of date that quickly? And what would it take to get there? It will take modeling, it will take partnerships and collaboration, and it will take a lot of experimentation to find out what we want first, what we want to find, how we want to find it, and how we want to grow that system over time. Thanks again to the conveners and hosts of Dark Archives, and I look forward very much to the conversations that will happen in the weeks ahead.